Okay, and do you have a notification that says Youri is recording the call?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, then we're in business. Okay. All right. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on this All Things Canada Black History Month special and our Make Me Wanna Holler All Things the Black Diaspora, I am so honored to be speaking with Desmond Cole. Desmond is an author, journalist, racial and social justice activist, and an abolitionist. And again, so honored that so honored to have him on. So first off, Desmond, thank you so much for joining me today. And and he's also the author of the book "The Skin We're In: A Year of Black Resistance and Power." It's on my list of books to get, so apologies in advance. But he's my guest for the hour. So Desmond, first off, thank you so much for coming on the program.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's a real honor to have you. But been wanting to have you on for a long time, ever since I first started One Plus One, and why, and of course wanting to cover not all things Canada, including the fact that Canada also has its own Jim Crow laws. It's also vicious history and still ongoing history of anti-black racism and whatnot. And you're of course one of the one of those what I love about you, Al Jones, Robin Maynard, and of course other people I've had on the program, whether it's Dimitri Lascaris, Neve Engler, Tyler Shipley. You're part of you're part of what I call the Canadian truth-telling myth-busting movement. So so again, it's a real honor to have you on. And all right, so let's get into it. Most of the questions I have for you are all about police brutality, and I know that you're an abolitionist, so explain why you are for police abolitionism as opposed to a series of radical reforms, meaning because you don't just want to demilitarize the police. You don't just want to you don't just want to just demilitarize the police and the drug war and a series of Neo-Dickensian laws which empower the police to be the thugs in blue and black that they are. You are for police abolitionism. So explain why police abolitionism as opposed to a series of radical reforms.
Okay. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that I'm not criticizing you for saying police brutality. I use the term myself, but I really like when people like Christina Sharp and other thinkers remind us that even just saying police brutality or police violence is kind of redundant. Policing is violence, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the reason I believe that I've evolved over the many years. I was a reformist, but I've evolved my position. Somebody said something really funny on Twitter today, Youri. They were like, when the spices in the back of the cupboard are old, you throw them out. You don't try to repurpose them, right? You get rid of them.
Yeah.
Right? So if we're critiquing something and we're talking about the kind of like life destroying consequences of something like the police, there's no room for reform because what we're critiquing is too serious. It's too urgent. And so I haven't seen reasonable so-called reforms, I guess, of policing that would actually address the everyday violence that is policing. I don't think those reforms exist. And I also think that people are really kind of committed to maintaining the police for the sake of maintaining the police. They don't actually have a reason why. And what people seem to be really scared of in particular is we very rarely get to have sincere conversations about what it would mean to abolish and dismantle the police. But there's an assumption that we don't believe in safety. And I'm all for safety, but why does it have to be this institution that we try to funnel all notions of safety and all the resources for safety through? What if we did it another way? It's just a lack of courage and creativity and flexibility, I think, on many of our parts that says, if you don't want the cops, you're crazy. Like, yeah, I don't want the cops. And I actually think in most practical situations, most other people don't want the cops either. But they're so committed to the fantasy and the fetishization of policing, of the guys that come and save you, that they act like that's what's being taken away. And it is. It's like we're not actually threatening some notion of safety that the police are holding up. We're threatening the fantasy of policing that doesn't exist. But people are very committed to that fantasy. So that's the reason why I don't believe in reforms. Like, the police, in the worst cases, take our lives. You know, Tarish Bobby Ramroop died in October falling from the building of his Jane and Finch apartment after about 20 police officers did like...
This is in Canada, right?
This is in Toronto.
Yeah.
This is in Jane and Finch. Tarish was in mental health crisis, and someone called the police, and the police engaged in an hours-long standoff, during which time they denied his family the ability to go up to his apartment where he was alone and talk to him. And he eventually tried to climb out the window, presumably out of fear of the police being around his property and coming to get him. You know, a year ago, Moses Hererhi, a black man in a parking lot in York Region, was murdered by a police officer. Now the story has come out a year later in an SIU report clearing the officer who shot Moses 3 times. And it said that the encounter began by the officer seeing Moses peeing in a snowbank. What reform?
And was Moses also going through a mental health crisis?
No, not that anybody understands. Is literally a police officer engaging in an interaction that didn't need to happen. I'm sure maybe in his eyes wanting to say issue a ticket, but this is the violence of these bylaws and of these bureaucracies that say if you're doing something like peeing outside, you need to be processed by the state. And if you don't want to be, then I have the right to use as much force as I want against you, up until lethal force. So it's actually your fault that you didn't accept the ticket if I kill you, right? What reforms are people proposing that would do away with this? Well, and that's individual examples, which I don't think we're really basing these ideas on when we talk about abolition. By the way, I'm very new to abolition. As I said, I was of a very reformist mentality for years. So I'm not here to preach to anybody or act like I'm an expert. I'm not. But can anyone propose a reform for the rife sexual harassment and abuse that women and queer people and the very few trans police officers that there are, right? Groups that Robin Maynard would call sexual minorities. Is there any reform that would stop the rampant, like, routine abuse of certain people in the police system itself? Is there any reform for the idea that the police are several times more likely than a member of the general public to engage in intimate partner violence? It's nice to say we want these things to stop. There's no actual concrete proposal to make them stop. There's wishes. There's wishes that it were not so. And I have gone to abolition because I'm tired of wishing that things were not so. I think you have to just stop the violence. And that's about destroying the institution that was created for the express purpose of engaging in violence. That's what the police are, whether people like that or not.
You know, actually, before I ask this question, which I'm sure you probably always get this question privately. Well, what about the murders? What about the response to domestic violence? But before we get into that, let me actually politely then push back on the whole notion that the police were created to be the state terrorists. They are, ergo there's no reform. So let me push back against you, in which now I completely agree with you that the police, whether it's the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police of Canada, whether it's the NYPD, LAPD, all of the police of the US, of course, Australia, New Zealand, even the Metropolitan Police, or what's called Scotland Yard in England, they were not created to be the people to, fight crime or catch a burglar. Of course, of course, they were given the license to do that, but no, they were created to be. I mean, the Scotland Yard was created to basically keep the Irish in line so that the British can continue to do their settler colonialism and to keep and to basically vanquish Scottish and Welsh nationalism and to keep the rest of the population in line, as well as being a classist system, persecuting the poor and so forth. We know that the police in the in the U.S. were created to be the pogroms of the death squad against Native Americans and slavery and so forth. Same with yours truly, Canada, because settler colonialism and so forth. But you could also say that modern day schooling or modern day social welfare services or adoption agencies were also created to be the racist, classist, anti-queer whatnots that they are. But there's lots of efforts to reform that, and of course, we as socialists, we want to see a welfare state that actually does help alleviate poverty and actually does help the people in need, not to be another layer of bureaucratic persecutors and so forth. So why are you so why we can reform schooling and all of that, but not an institution like the police then?
So I don't think abolition is the way I understand it. Again, I'm still learning. I don't think it's when you limit a policy prescription to one particular domain or department of government or whatever social issue. I would completely overhaul the school system as it exists now. I would destroy the child welfare system in Canada tomorrow if I could and start over. Like, the child welfare system is causing immeasurable harm without any, like, you can't destroy some people's lives. This is what we do in Canada. We try to play majority games, which the white majority will always win. You can't destroy some people's lives and then say, but the institution helps some people, so let's just balance the help with the destruction of other people's lives and just call it even. I don't want to do that. So I would completely dismantle the child welfare system and the prison system and the court system in this country. And I'm not alone. I just happen to be a journalist who's very interested in the police, who's had personal experiences with the police in my life, and who has studied how policing works across Canada. So I want to talk about police abolition, but that is not to the exclusion of dismantling all kinds of other harmful systems.
Very interesting response, and actually, and that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, actually, let me switch the questions around then. So, because I know you, so are you familiar with community control over the police? And if so, is that a way where we can see a world with less police? And if we and if we are going to defund the police, but we still have the police as, say, a necessary evil, but so we have community control over the police. Ergo, we are defunding the police, but we are explicitly saying to the police, okay, your only task is not to be handing out tickets. It's not to be harassing the homeless and so forth. It's to actually, a murder just happened, right? A murder happened over here. Go and investigate that. So would you be in favor of community control over the police? I'm sure you're familiar with the late Glenn Ford and the team at Black Agenda Report. That's often a very strong advocate of community control of the police. I'm curious your response.
I'm not so familiar, but I guess we have to describe and define what we mean when we say community control of the police. So let me back up for a minute and say that my biggest issue with policing is that it is the legal right to cause harm without consequence. That's what policing is when you, it's not about you, and people get angry when we say things like this because they're like, then they're like, oh, so you're saying that the only reason cops sign up is to be violent and to cause harm. No, I'm talking about what distinguishes a cop legally from somebody else. I'm talking about why when a cop does something that the rest of us would go to jail for, why they don't even face a trial, right? That's what I'm interested in. So before we talk about whether it's community control or what, because I'd like to note, Youri, that technically speaking, we have community control of the police right now. We have a civilian oversight of the police in Ontario and in other parts of Canada through civilian-led police services boards. And if you look at the diagram of like the police, the chief is here, right? But the board is up here, like they're his boss. The board hires the chief, right? So in theory, we already have civilian control of the police, and it's not actually really working. So I would need more definition, I guess, about what we mean there. But let me now return to the law. The law gives the police the right to use as much force as is necessary up until a lethal force for a police officer who feels that their safety is compromised in danger or that the safety of somebody else is in danger. That gives them the right to use as much force as they would like up until killing somebody, including killing somebody. It doesn't stop at killing somebody. It's allowed. I don't believe in that. So whatever kind of police force people want to have, and I wouldn't call them the police, by the way, in my ideal, because I just want to get rid of that idea and start over. But whatever we want to call them, we will still call them the police for the purposes of this conversation. They should not have the right to kill. If you take a life, you have to be held accountable in society, period. So you should not have the right to kill and to use force indiscriminately and be protected under law. That's what separates the police from everybody else. And no matter who's supposedly in control, that law needs to be struck down. That's in the criminal code.
So is that why then? So what you just explained. So is that why when we do have a trial for a police officer that's murdered an unarmed man or woman for whatever reason? It could be a Freddie Gray incident. It could be a George Floyd incident, or the countless of the pandemic, if you will, of Indigenous, Black, and queer people who are murdered with impunity by the police. Is that why when it does go into trial and lawyers, do explain to the layman or woman or person that, hey, look, this is what the law says about the police, and the police have every right if they feel threats. And is that why, even if people think, well, I mean, this police officer should go to jail, but if that's what the law says, well, then okay, not guilty for the people who beaten Rodney King or the people who murdered Amadou Diallo?
Yes. In short, I would say yes. And I think we have to remember that it's not just what the law says, it's also case law. It's how the law has been interpreted for decades, given how it's been tested in court, right? So you don't just have a law protecting the police and giving them the benefit of the doubt. You have decades of case law excusing the police for various forms of violence. And you have a dynamic where the very court system that we're expecting to prosecute the police relies on police evidence as like one of the highest forms of civilian or of human testimony that you can get. Courts consider lots of,
and then that goes into why you say there is no room for reform, because the system of policing was built to be rotten to the core.
Well,
racist to the core, classist to the core, whatever you want to call it, but state terror to the core.
What I would say is the minute that you become reliant on the police and their credibility for like a foundation of your court system, then turning around and saying they're dishonest, they cheat, they lie, they beat people, they ignore certain forms of violence while causing others. That doesn't really work in a court system who relies on the legitimacy of policing to conduct their affairs. So like, it just seems like the deck is stacked. And the reason why, first of all, because we talk about killing, most police violence is not killing. The vast, 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 vast majority of police violence is not killing. It's harassing, it's abusing, it's stalking, it's surveilling, it's following children home from school and asking them where they're going and taking their information down. It's pulling people over in their cars when they're not doing anything. It's going to a demonstration and assaulting people who are engaging in what Canada calls freedom of expression, which apparently the police can just decide is now a crime. Like, that's the majority of what the police do. And it would be really hard in a court to continually discredit its own police officers and say that they made a bad judgment, that they acted recklessly, that they took their power for granted, and then turn around the next day and have 50 court cases where civilians go to jail on police evidence. This is the contradiction of the system. This is why we have to overhaul it, because the system needs a certain high standard of presumed legitimacy on the part of the police in order to function. So what you get is you get justified violence. And again, I think that would be a good definition of what is the police, what makes them different from everybody else, is that in the overwhelming majority of cases, the state, the courts interpret police violence as justified violence. Even if they're not arguing that it is violence, they will say, yes, it's violence, but it's justified violence.
That kind of Neo-Dickensianism of broken windows theory, or in Britain what was known during the Victorian period, Charles Dickens' time, like, Neo-Dickensian policies, right?
Well, is it justified to stop somebody on the street in a so-called high crime, broken windows neighborhood? Does it become justified to take people's freedoms away from them because you're afraid, say, of the neighborhood, that they live in? I would say no, but this is what policing is. This is what it does. And of course, policing also creates this spiral where we're always talking about the lack of safety. But no matter how much policing you add, which is, I'm afraid everybody, not everybody, but there's far too many people who simply they prescribe more policing whenever something scares them. It hasn't made our communities safer. So I don't want to reform that. I want to start over. And so, sorry, let me just finish this other part of this whole legal thing.
Go ahead.
Because the police have the right to use this amount of force that I'm saying. They also have weapons that the rest of us don't have. And that's the second part of the kind of my thinking around abolition is whatever safety intervention we would like to have as people, they should not have the right to use indiscriminate force or to kill. And they should not be given a set of military weapons in order to do their work. If we started with just those two things and we could agree on them, we would be a long way away from what we do now. And a lot of people are like, well, what's the point of the police if they don't have weapons? And I'm like, yes, precisely. That's why I wouldn't call them the police, because they're decidedly something else. If you're going to intervene in a situation to support somebody, but you don't need these weapons and don't need a law saying I can kill you if I need to, you're dealing with something quite different. But I think it would be better.
But so then, if we do abolish the police, how would we deal with the issues of, say, organized crime, or when a terrorist or extremist attack happens, and of course, the issue of murders, domestic violence, and sexual assaults?
Okay, so a few things here. First is, I think that abolition is a process. It describes a process rather than an act that you do to like radically reorganize things. So
Okay.
what I would say first is we need to have a social consensus that the police as they exist right now are unacceptable. Let's just say that. We have to get there. And once we get there to that social consensus, then we need to make a plan for how to transition this harmful institution out and bring in something new. We don't just do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
You talked about socialism. I don't believe that your ability to work in the society determines your value. And I actually don't want to see thousands of people who used to have a job with the government be thrown into poverty because I don't like what they do. I really don't want that. And people really don't understand that, Youri. They think that we're out to get the police. I'm very indifferent to the police as individuals. I don't care either way about them as individuals as long as they stop fucking hurting and killing our people. So it's not about punishing them. It's not about throwing them out of work so that they and their families are destitute. We need to process. We need to transition away from policing, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to make a 10-year plan for how to do that until we first agree that we need to. So I spend a lot of my time trying to get us building that social consensus. So that's one thing. How do we handle the rapists and the murderers and whatnot? Everybody's favorite question.
Yeah. The mafia. I'm sure you probably get that.
So the like no cap, the police are the mafia. What the fuck are we talking about? Like, can I be serious?
Go ahead.
An institution with a brotherhood that protects itself above all others, is willing to kill for one another, is willing to defend murder. Like in my book, I talk about the killing of Abdurrahman Abdi in Ottawa by a police officer, Daniel Monsian, who beat Abdurrahman with his hands using like reinforced gloves that were not issued by the police.
Wow.
He beat our brother to death. Some will make a technicality and say, well, he revived and regained consciousness at some point. You caused the man's death. Let's just cut to the chase. He didn't die by accident. He was acquitted in a court of law. He's one of the few cops who's ever been charged with manslaughter in the 30-plus year history of the Special Investigations Unit in Ontario, and he still beat the charge, okay? That's murder. That's homicide. The judge didn't agree with my interpretation of what that is, but I don't think a civilian would have gotten away with that. And I don't think that it was right or justified. So for me, like, there's your murderer that we're all obsessing over. And now that murderer gets to go back to the same police force, patted on the back by everyone and told, actually, you didn't do anything wrong. You beating this man the way that you did is a part of your job. Like, we're not even disagreeing. The police say it was part of his job, and I'm critical of that, but we're not actually disagreeing with each other. Like, I'm like, your role is violence, and they're like, yeah, but it's just justified violence. So there's your murderer. That's what we need to worry about. Like, and I'm gonna, but let's keep going. Sexual assault. In the United States, they have studies saying that police officers are engaging in intimate partner violence at 5 times the rate of the general public.
So the police, meaning the police themselves, engage in domestic violence.
Individual officers, whether that be on duty or like not on duty, but like in their own homes. And remember, police officers are armed. So this is going back to the second part of my issue here, right? They get to take a weapon home. So now you're a man. You're probably a bigger man than average if you're selected to be a police officer. Usually you probably work out a lot, right? And now you get to have a weapon that you get to take home. If you didn't already have weapons at home, now you have one. And when you get into an argument with your partner, you have this thing at your disposal that the average person does not have, which you have a legal right to have, by the way, in your house. And you're part of a culture, more importantly, a macho, very violent culture that says, again, that any violence that you engage in is actually justified. So we don't have that statistic in Canada, But anecdotally, look at our police and our military. Like, look what's happening in the Canadian military right now and how routine sexual harassment and assault are. But what is also routine is that no one's held accountable for these acts. So I'm comfortable anecdotally with saying that, like, empowering men with the kind of power that police have is creating sexual violence, domestic violence. It's creating more of this shit than it is getting rid of it. But now let's get to the, I think, deeper and more important part of this often asked question. Do you need a gun to investigate a murder? Do you need a gun and a license to kill to investigate a sexual assault? People in our communities investigate these kinds of things all the time, especially when they come from a community where the police don't care to investigate what's happening to them. We do it ourselves. We don't do it with weapons. We don't go around looking for the burglar or the murderer or the rapist out around every corner. This is, again, like, this is the fetish that I'm talking about. You can investigate crime without a weapon and a license to kill. So I'm all for investigating crime and holding people who engage in antisocial behavior accountable. You don't need a gun. You don't need a license to kill. You don't need to beat someone up and put them in a jail cell when you do apprehend them for one of these crimes. But again, we don't like to acknowledge it. The police is a part of the retributive aspect of our society, like prison and jail, where if we think you've done something, we get to mistreat you even before we prove that you've done it. So the police who kill, the police who beat, the police who do all of these things, they're acting like judge, jury, and executioner, as is the prison system, where we send people to be tortured. You know that the vast majority, I think it's around 70%. I was watching a program about the bail system in Canada the other night. 70% of the people in jail in Canada are on remand. And what that means is they are either waiting to get a bail hearing.
Okay.
Or they've been denied bail, but they haven't gone to trial yet. Meaning
because most of these people are poor people who don't have the financial means to, hey, yes,
so if you commit a crime, but you're willing to, somebody who cares about you is willing to put up a whack of money, it's a good chance you'll be released, right? If you don't have that, it's a greater chance that you won't be. But like, this is like, according to the way lawyers and people talk, like, this is legal innocence. Like, if you're innocent until proven guilty, then that means 70% of the people who are in jail in Canada, not prison, jail, that means 70% of them are legally innocent. They've not been convicted of anything. But there's endless amounts of torture and suffering in jail. There are endless amounts of people who are re-victimized, who are charged with yet another crime being in jail when they didn't have to be there. What I'm saying once again here is, like, I'm skeptical that this is a system that we can't afford to get rid of because it's so fundamental. And a lot of it is based on the idea of retribution for perceived crime and deterrence. So if we make jail really disgusting and horrible and violent, if we make the police really big and scary and violent, you won't want to commit the crime. That is probably the most central reason why people are afraid to get rid of the police, because in their mind, the police's very presence as a dominating, scary force, and jail as prison as being like disgusting, scary places, that's what keeps people behaving well. And if you take those things away, the criminals come out to play. Youri, I don't believe it. I don't believe that the reason that people behave well in society is because they're afraid of the police coming and killing them. I think that's false. I think that there's decades of psychological research that demonstrates that that's not why people decide to act the way that they do. And I think we need to get away from the punitive and the seemingly deterrent approaches which these kinds of systems promote.
Then I want your response to this. I then want your response to this. What's your response to some of those well-meaning people, part of the police reformist movement, not the abolitionist movement, but the police reformist movement, who say that if we gave the police more money, more training, more education, with a little bit of a social justice, twist to it, that's how we, overcome mass police corruption and brutality. And then, what's your response to the former Green Party leader, Annemie Paul, who once said, in her response to defund the police, abolition of the police, she said that she completely agrees. We need more that we need more social justice programs. We need more money to combat poverty and so forth. But there are murderers and rapists. Ergo, the police are a necessary evil. And there are some people in which no amount of social justice programs and whatever will reform them. Ergo, the police are a necessary evil. And your response to that.
Okay, so the first question, let's reform them, let's give them more training, let's put more money into it. I'm open-minded. I just want people to make some sense. What do you mean training? What do you mean? And what about all of the training that has been done? When people even talk about so let's do this now. Okay, so I was reading a report about police violence in Ontario from the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And it was around this time that the government was realizing that they had to create an independent police oversight, which we now call the Special Investigations Unit, because there was just so much dissatisfaction, particularly among Black people and others, about the police investigating themselves when they committed a crime. I was reading this report and watching what people were saying, this is, 35 years ago. They were saying training, better funding, diversity.
Yes.
So with respect to the reformists, we have tried every solution that they just keep reflexively putting forward, and there is nothing to show for these ideas. They are wishes. It's nice to wish that something would be different. It's not working. It doesn't work. So if somebody can demonstrate to me as some kind of specific proposal that is not a theory, but that is demonstrated to somehow not. I mean, I'm well past thinking. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think that such a thing exists. But
I can tell.
I also think that people don't take it upon themselves to explain that they think it's enough just to say, well, more training. So let's break some of these down one by one, because I try to read about these things. Training for police. What are you going to train them to do differently? I
think they would say, so if somebody is having a schizophrenic episode, the police should learn how you de-escalate a situation, and I guess they would have somebody who works in a mental institution always on there with them when responding to a mental health crisis. And
Mm-hmm.
the police don't the police basically act as a social worker and don't use the gun.
But then why? So why do they have a gun if they're not going to use it? This is exactly my point. A social worker doesn't need a gun. I used to work at a youth center. People brought weapons into my youth center. There were fights in my youth center. I didn't have the right to carry a weapon and to mete out my form of justice if I thought that something was going wrong. I was expected to deal with situations like that in a nonviolent way, which preserved the life and safety of the people I was serving. If what we want is a social worker, let's send a social worker. I mean, there are lots of critiques of the social work system, by the way. But my point is, if what you're saying is send a social, see, what's embedded in that idea is that the person experiencing mental health crisis might turn violent. And that's why you need to have the backup of lethal force there. To which I would say, in Canada, people experiencing mental health issues or a substance abuse, not substance abuse, excuse me, that's a very badly outdated term. I should know better. Addictions. People experiencing these things are far more likely to be assaulted by a police officer or another member of the public as they are to do the assaulting. That's lots of years of statistical evidence. So I don't have to prove that to anybody. It's only our fear, our stigma of people who are experiencing these kinds of situations that says you've got to have the gun as a backup. I just fundamentally disagree. I'm not going to allow it. If what is needed is a nonviolent response, send a nonviolent response. There are lots of places where we can look at where we've had alternate calls diverted away from 911 and police to alternate services of like crisis response. They don't kill anyone, Youri. They don't kill a single person. They don't beat anybody. These have been done in Canada and the United States. There's a group called Cahoots that was featured in a movie that I watched that are in the United States. They've responded to like tens of thousands of mental health calls. They've never killed anybody. But if you're paranoid, which white supremacy makes people paranoid, you will always say the gun has to be there just in case, because a gun could pop out of anywhere. Someone could always turn violent. That's white supremacist paranoia. So no, we're not going to train a cop to be a social worker when what we're really saying is we don't need the cop. Diversity is another one. We've been talking about diversifying police forces in Canada since the 1980s. So,
in other words, more women, more Black people from the community. I guess more Indigenous people, more queer people from the community.
Yep, that's right. And my question is why? Why? Are we presuming
when there are actually no, sorry, I'm interrupting too much.
The question then becomes for me: are we presuming that Black police officers would treat Black people better? Because it's always also said, well, those should be the cops in those communities. And I'm like, but why? Why? Why can't somebody of a different race treat me with dignity and respect? Why? I don't agree with the formulation on its face. But again, the 40-year history of diversifying police forces in Canada would suggest to me that it actually doesn't make a fucking difference anyway. The murder of Tyree Nichols by 5 Black police officers would suggest that it doesn't make a difference because the police are literally mafia. They are a gang. They are taught to be loyal to the institution and to each other rather than to the civilian population. So saying it's about race or it's about gender or other factors misunderstands the nature of police culture. And that's why sexual violence and harassment is rife within policing. That's why when the Black officer watches his white partner do something wrong and decides to say something, that he's basically marginalized for the rest of his career and no one answers his call. And I've heard that story. Like that's almost a trope by now, that like there's a notion of snitching inside of the police force, which regulates people's behavior and keeps them in line.
The blue wall of silence. The most notorious case being Frank Serpico, the famous NYPD whistleblower. Talk a bit more about that to make the case of police abolitionism.
Well, yeah, I mean, I always try to use Canadian examples. So
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Let me just say, like, we have seen detailed testimonials. I follow a lot of women on social media who are suing Ontario police forces right now for being harassed and assaulted because some of them have very courageously come out publicly to tell their stories. How do you think the police feel about people who do something like this? They're traitors. To the police, they're traitors. And if you're telling me you're here to uphold the law and public safety and all this, why would you deem somebody a traitor who outs people for telling the truth? I mentioned Daniel Monsión killing Abdurrahman Abdi. I didn't get to it, but the reason I brought that up is because when he was on trial, the Ottawa Police Association created wristbands with his badge number on them and the words "United We Stand." They didn't just hand those out. They sold them, actually. They didn't just sell them to police officers in Ottawa. They sold them to police officers who wanted them all across Canada. So you would think that if the police believe in justice and somebody beats somebody to death with non-approved gloves, that the police would so-called throw that person under the bus. We don't need you. Like, you're not one of us. You don't, all these nice liberal formulations of like, that doesn't represent who we are. No, no, no. They circled the wagon big time. Imagine being in Ottawa and you're getting stopped by a police officer on the street. Black person gets pulled over and that cop comes up and you see them wearing a wristband of a killer who's before the courts right now. I'm sorry, like, we're trying to reform these people's institution and they're telling us we won't let you. I'll give you another example of that in Canada. The RCMP were told after George Floyd was murdered to stop using a technique that cuts off blood to your brain by pushing on your carotid artery, right? The carotid artery delivers blood to your brain. If you push on somebody's carotid artery and hold it with enough force, you stop the oxygen to their brain, they pass out. After George Floyd, the federal government directed our Royal Canadian Mounted Police to stop using this technique. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police said, we're going to go and think about that. And they just came back recently and they said, hey, federal government, thanks for the suggestion. No, we're not going to stop using this technique because who the fuck are you to tell us how to police you? We get to tell you how you will be safe or not safe, so we don't have to take your direction. I'm just listening to what the police are telling us. I'm not trying to make them better than they are. I'm just listening to what they're telling us. And what they're telling us is you don't get to tell us what to do. You don't get to punish us. You don't get to hold us accountable. You don't get to take away our funding. Like, let's just take them at their word and stop offering reform that they're not interested in.
And actually, before I get before I get to this question, but then it sounds to me as if if we sort of go back to, well, what do we do about the terrorist attack that happens? Well, what do we do about the bank robber, or what do we do about the whatever organized crime elements? It could be the Italian the Italian Canadian mafia, or the drug dealers. It sounds to me as if, well, first of all, if we ended the drug war, that would overnight eliminate organized crime. If we got rid of, if we even devoted 1/10 of what we give to the police, or there's the issue of NATO. Like, I heard, like, Tamara Lawrence explained to me that that 2% that we spend on GDP on militarism, you could eliminate indigenous poverty overnight. You could actually merge mental health care with a single payer system, and you could do so much investing in education and poverty alleviation that overnight most of the supposed crimes that are committed would go away overnight. Would that sort of be your response to when people say, well, what about the mafia? What about
in some sense? But I mean, I'm glad that we're using crime in scare quotes here, because that's how I feel. Really, I think we need to challenge the very notion of what we are even talking about when we say crime, because when the police are, for example, kicking people out of our parks in downtown Toronto because they're homeless and have nowhere else to go, when police are mobilizing in the 200s and 300s, as we saw in the summer of 2021, to go and do this disgusting work, they're not fighting crime. But I've never seen police in my country go 200 and 300 deep to get the mafia that we're talking about anywhere. Like, I've just actually never seen that happen. So I'm always questioning the premise, Youri. I'm skeptical of the fantasy that people are painting when there's no evidence for it. How do you address the organized crime, though? Yeah, I think ending the drug war is an amazing, amazing first step that's going to do more than any police force ever could. Like, again,
and if somebody is addicted to drugs and they're abusing drugs, then okay, yes, we'll deal with that. We deal with that the way we the way we want to deal with people who actually are affected with chronic mental health issues, which is you approach it with a social justice, compassionate lens, not have them racking and stacking in prison, or I use that term because John Pilger, when he confronted a prison corrections facilitator in after a disgusting death of an Aboriginal man who was cooked to death in an overheated van, when he was saying, is Western Australia building more prisons? She says, oh, well, right now they're racking and stacking them at the moment. So no, if you actually want to deal with all of the supposed problems that are in impoverished community, you fight poverty and you eradicate institutional racism, white supremacy.
Well, and again, my work is, would we agree that you can more easily dismantle organized antisocial activity by just changing what we call crime and approaching it differently? Like, I think that that's a really easy, you have to, in my view, like, this might sound prejudiced on my part, but you have to have an agenda, in my view, to say that, or a deep bias against, say, drug use, to say that decriminalization will fight the effects of, say, the drug trade more than the police. If you don't believe that, I feel like you're being a bit dishonest in your approach to the conversation. But also, like, you mentioned drug abuse, and it's my fault. I introduced the word abuse into the conversation. But what about just drug use? Like, why are rich people allowed to put drugs up their nose and have no consequences? But that's not okay if you're poor and outside where people can see you. Like, we're not really concerned about drug use. We're not. Like, that's where the term abuse comes from, because it's this idea that, like, if you can't handle how you use your drugs, then we should punish you. But we're not punishing all of the people who are using drugs in a way that is not seen socially. And I don't think we should. I don't want to do that. I actually support people using drugs, but I support people having options, having education, having safe places to use, having safe supply, these kinds of things. And if somebody wanted to make an argument to me that more policing would more quickly address the harms of the drug trade today than just decriminalizing everything and providing supports for people to use drugs safely, I feel that person has either come to that conclusion from a complete lack of education and information and evidence, or that they're engaging in bad faith because they have a bias of some kind that they are hoping that the police will continue to enforce for them. So all these things that we're told only the police can address. Here, let's do the fun one. Let's just get it out of the way, because I feel like maybe it's sometimes important to say this one too. Okay, there's a man with a gun. Right, the bomb is about to go off in Times Square. Whatever the fuck you want. Okay, but like, when I talk about white paranoia and white supremacist paranoia, right? Why is this the first thing that always comes to people's mind when we talk about the police? Because it's like the least likely scenario to happen. Like, it's a movie. So why do we always go to the not like who will profile my children in school if there's no police? Like, let's talk about that one. That's actually real. Who will stop black people who are walking indiscriminately down the street when we don't have the police? Why do we have to go to the most sensational example when that's not usually what the police do? But fine, I'll give you your ticking time bomb, as they like to call it, scenario.
Yes.
Okay, there's a man
which is always used to justify torture, is that ticking time bomb scenario.
So there's a man with a gun, and he means to harm people. Maybe he's already started harming people. Okay. I believe that in that scenario, it's justified to approach that person with as much force as they're using. In terms of like what you can carry with you to approach them. I'm trying to remember, there are so many mass shootings in America that I can no longer remember each one individually, but there was one recently where a man was killing several people, and he had a semi-automatic weapon, and a civilian came and disarmed that man. Do you remember what I'm talking about here? There's a video of it.
Yeah.
This was in the last month.
Yeah.
In America. And the civilian disarmed the guy, and then was like, when he had his weapon, he's like, get out of here, get back, stay away from me. If that person, heaven forbid this, I don't like putting this energy out into the universe, but if that person who disarmed the killer had then turned his own weapon against that guy, everybody would have been like, oh, beautiful. That's great. Not everybody, but a lot of people would have been. I think a majority of people would have been like, sure, absolutely. He deserved to die. But what that civilian demonstrated is that there was no need for that level of force. And this is our problem with the police, is that when you give people that much power, you tend to then justify their use of it in every case, even when it isn't necessary. So you can still go to the scene and deal with it without using lethal force. There was a man whose name I'm not going to say. He's very well known around here. He killed 10 people in Toronto by driving his car on the sidewalk on Yonge Street in North York several years ago. Most of the people he killed were women. When the police finally got there, because remember, the police don't stop crime, they respond to crime. And no matter how many police officers you have, they can't stop somebody from that's like the crazy movie scenario. And the cops couldn't do anything about it. And it's not their fault that they couldn't do anything about it. That's just humanity. But when they got there, they arrested him and took him into custody without firing a shot or throwing a punch. And the cop who arrested him and took him into custody was hailed as a freaking hero. Like he had done something extraordinary by not harming this man. And I'm like, that should simply be the standard. And in that situation, yes, they had weapons. Nobody pulled one out because they didn't need to. And if you did pull one out in that situation and you used it, we have to hold you to a level of accountability for doing something like that, that is reflective of how much we hate violence in every case, not just for somebody who we think deserves it or whatever. So yeah, in the very, very few 0.001% cases where we're dealing with a bomb in a building, a person, the man who ran up into Parliament with a gun and he wanted to, I guess, get at politicians. Yes, I do believe that responding with an armed response in that case is justified. But I am not going to make that the standard for the police officer standing over here outside of a manhole that's open watching a construction crew, because they're legally required to do that, and he's got a gun on his hip. Or when I went and did a talk in Southern Ontario this weekend, 2 cops came into the cafe that I was at, and they were chilling for like an hour in the cafe in uniform with a weapon on, sitting at a table next to like kids walking in with a gun. No, the standard for all police is not going to be what we need for the worst case scenario. But white supremacist paranoia will lead you to the worst case scenario planning when you're always afraid of black people, indigenous people, poor people, etc.
But then I want your response to because I was amazed when I talked with Margaret Kimberly and a good friend of yours, Al Jones, one of my favorite guests I have on the program, and
Love
they were and they were saying to me when I was when I brought up the incident of, well, what if we just pay the police more, if we gave them a living wage, or we give them special treatment the way we treat the military, wouldn't that eliminate police corruption and so forth like that? And in the UK, in the UK, where this awful modeling of policing was exported to the rest of the world, during Jeremy Corbyn's run for prime minister against Theresa May, there was lots of crime, a lot of that associated with austerity. But instead of, bizarrely enough, this social justice politician, it went, the argument was that that the police have also been victims of austerity. They're also part of the working class, and if we just reversed austerity on the police, gave the police more money, that would help solve a lot of the crime problems that that happen in the UK. And I'm curious your response to your response to that.
Well, my country is a wonderful case study for anybody who wants to know what happens when you pay police exorbitantly and give them great benefits. And like, we have a policing culture in Canada that says that not only are the police some of the most important people in our society, that they need to be paid accordingly. So most police officers in Canada, no, let me not say Canada. I don't know about the whole country. Let me start with Toronto, the largest city. The place where it's said to have the most crime, and so presumably where the police are the most important. Most police officers, after a couple of years in Toronto, make over $100,000 a year. Our city councilors make about $100,000 a year, just to give you a little bit of a baseline.
So the police, so the police are paid in the thousands. Local politicians are paid in the kind of hundreds, or
no. It's comparable. Like I'm saying, like a low level, like say 3 to 5 year constable on the Toronto Police can easily make as much as the politicians who are supposed to oversee them. Like that's not weird. Okay. But then if you get to be 10, 15 years in the police, we're talking about $150,000, $170,000. Has it done anything to improve the issues that we're talking about here today? No, it hasn't. When you want to be part of the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, it's the same thing. You start at, I was tweeting about this the other day. You start at a base salary of, it was something like, let's say about $60,000 a year. But only within like a very short amount of time, if you pass through your probation period and all that, you're immediately bumped up to now where you're like 85, 90,000. And then it just increases from there. What worker gets these kinds of like increases that they can expect for them and everyone else who does their job besides the police? Like nobody who works at like a grocery store or who delivers mail or who flies a plane can expect these kinds of increases on a year-to-year basis. Like our police are not affected by austerity, and it has made no difference to what you're talking about. Now, as for other countries where maybe you can make an argument in some parts of the United States that, okay, the police don't make as much as other people. Are they killing and surveilling and harassing because they don't have... Would we make this argument for anyone else literally in society? Like, come on. You know,
yeah,
it doesn't.
Actually, sorry to interrupt, but it just reminds me of what Elle said. She was saying, where do people apply this logic? If a teacher got angry at her kids and murdered a bunch of them, we would never say, oh, let's get let's pay her more. The police constantly gets to fuck up on the job and so forth, and our continuous response is, oh, we need to pay them more money and hopefully they won't be engaging in corruption.
But like, I want to add that this is a way of avoiding what the problem is, number one, because the problem isn't really about, for example, compensation. But to anybody who is under the illusion that the police are, as you mentioned earlier, part of the working class, I would say this.
Yes, exactly. That's what I want you to get at.
One of the largest divisions of the police in Toronto is called 52 Division. They police in an area of the downtown core of Toronto, and they're notoriously horrible. They have a Facebook page, okay? And so they post whatever they want to on their Facebook page of this police division. When we were in the midst of a very big and effective $15 minimum wage campaign here in Ontario, people at the 52 Division decided to post on Facebook about how actually these increases for minimum wage workers are bad and harmful for our society. Why would the police do this? And if you think that that's just a weird example of one police division or some rogue guy behind a Facebook group saying something that most police wouldn't believe, who gets called, as I mentioned earlier, when people go in a labor dispute and say, I'm not going to go to work today, instead I'm going to stand on a picket line? Who comes to bust their faces and take people to jail and defend the property of the employer? The police do. They're not part of the working class. The police engage in labor negotiations, knowing that like they have a like armed force of members. So a couple examples on that front. When Lester Donaldson was murdered by a police officer in 1988 in Toronto, and that was the very first time that a police officer in Ontario was charged with manslaughter, in response, the police essentially went on strike, Youri. They came to work without their weapons in many cases. they sat in their patrol cars and refused to answer calls because they were mad that one of their colleagues got charged for actually killing someone. And again, these are the people who were being told we need to protect us and keep us safe. You don't keep your so-called service weapon at home if you're part of the working class. You don't go to a demonstration, as the police did many years ago, again, for a labor dispute. They were mad at their contract offer. About 100 of them went down to the public square, Nathan Phillips Square, right by the city hall. And they came with their weapons. No one in the so-called working class is allowed to come to a labor dispute with a weapon, but the police did it. And when they were asked why they did it, they were like, well, we could be in danger. This is modern policing. It's bringing...
In other words, go on.
It's bringing yourself into a situation that doesn't require your armed presence, and then making yourself the target, the victim, the person that we all need to feel bad and sorry for. These people are not aligned with the working class. And if the working class gather with placards, the people with the guns come to tell them you're breaking the law, you're causing a disturbance, get lost. They're actually like diametrically opposed to the working class, because it's the elite class telling the police, protect our property, protect our interests from working class people. So we have to actually get rid of this idea. I'd like for everybody to be paid equally. Like, that has nothing to do with police officers being allowed to continue using force under law. They're just different.
Yeah, a quick follow-up comment. I think it kind of goes to show that it kind of reminds me of what Margaret told me, that the police are basically a gang unto themselves. So when they do have a dispute with the New York mayor, what was the guy before the well, anyways. Doesn't matter.
Bloomberg.
No, De Blasio. When they have a dispute with someone like De Blasio, who showers them endlessly with money and all the funding and all the toys that they need to surveil us and whatnot. When they have a little dispute, the fact that they engage in that disgusting behavior of, I'm not going to respond to a 911 call, I'm going to turn my back on the mayor, when they're supposed to be protecting and serving supposedly all of us. It goes to show you that it's a monstrous institution, which as you and others would say, needs to be abolished. But then, but then the second to last question of mine is all that being said, are groups like whatever local Black Lives Matter or whatever racial justice movement which you engage in, are they starting more and more to connect police brutality or state terror, defunding and demilitarizing, to Canada's secret services and Canadian imperialism and the Canadian military? And so I'm curious about that, because most of the times when I do ask that question, the response has usually been, sadly, Youri, no, that's not happening, but I'm curious. Yeah.
Well, I would suggest that I can't say no one's doing that. I think we fall into the trap sometimes of no one's doing this, no one's talking about this, right? When we just might not know, or that their voices might not be loud or being amplified, or their work being amplified. In my experience, I would agree that we're not doing enough of the kind of like scaling across different institutions and making this common critique across. But I think that that's often a function of these institutions are large. Fighting against any single one of them is really complex. And so, you can spend your whole life just engaging in the policing system or the child welfare system, or the systems that kick our children out of school, suspensions and expulsions. Like, these are categories unto themselves, and there's very few people doing a big share of the work. So I think that makes it very difficult, as our movements are too small. Canada is a very, very big country, it's hard to connect across the unfathomable geography of Canada. Like, you can fly across Europe while you take the time to fly across Canada. It's that big. So it's like like we expect, you know, this kind of solidarity because of a fake border that's not really, I think, in many cases realistic, even with the internet, even with the technologies that we have today. You're still asking a lot of people to be able to make these bigger connections and alliances to one another. But you have to learn, and you have to grow, I feel like. And you know, we've had a really bad experience, in my opinion, here with what the group that kind of took on the biggest mantle of Black Lives Matter officially, which is Black Lives Matter Toronto. I wrote very glowingly and appreciatively of BLM Toronto in my book, talking about them stopping the Pride Parade in 2016, which was a monumental disruption, really important point for all of us to read about and reflect on. Is why I did a whole chapter researching the history of Black queer exclusion from Pride. They did a lot of really good work in the early days, and I'll always salute them for it. And in the last few years, they've become a farce, a very disgusting, I would say, like, about face has taken place here from, like, you know, advocating a set of values and then completely turning their backs on those values in favor of getting money, getting corporate sponsorship, getting disproportionate amounts of money from BLM Global in the United States under the dubious leadership of Patrice Cullors and others. They had lots of time.
I know. I have issues with Alicia Garza and kind of, yeah. Continue on with what you were saying.
Well, you know, so I'm not going to get into all of that in detail right now, but
yeah,
suffice it to say that and I wasn't part of the BLM official kind of like grouping here. I followed them, I reported on them a lot, and I really tried to support them for years because I really believed in what they were doing at the time. That's over now. But I think one lesson that we might learn is that, yes, it's good to scale up, as we say, and to maybe think about it that way. But the most important organizing is always going to be local. And I think that what's really important is that we keep to the local. We stay connected to what's happening around us because that's what we're most easily able to access. And then we make connections. Not that we have these national organizations that are now applying for nonprofit charitable status, that are now taking untold amounts of money from corporations, which BLM Canada now does. The people who started BLMTO, 4 of them, decided to become something called BLM Canada now. And they decided that the big focus for them now was not kind of on the ground activism. It was art and other kinds of pursuits. They've taken money from Coca-Cola. They've taken money from Amazon. They've taken money from the same city of Toronto that they campaigned against for years. And they've justified all of this by being like, we personally could never be corrupted. So it's fine. It's fine for us to take this money because we're the good guys, right? I think all of this is really sad, but I think it's what happens when our work becomes professionalized, when our work becomes part of the nonprofit
industrial complex.
Yeah, I think this is what happens, is that we want to be taken seriously in some way, but what that means is, in so-called, again, scaling up and broadening our reach, we abandon the local work that maybe got us to where we were and informed in a much more concrete way what we are doing. I support people who are, for example, I mentioned like sexual assault and harassment in the Canadian military. I support people who are doing that work. I try to follow it. I try to read up and have a basic understanding. But I'm not jumping into that area tomorrow because that's not what I do. And I don't think that we all have to do everything in order to have good movements. We have to have connections. We have to have that great word, solidarity, with other people who are doing that work, even if we're not doing it, even if we don't always understand. We have to educate ourselves to a point where we can say that aligns with my values. I support that. I'm in solidarity, and slowly, hopefully, we begin to build those alliances. I think a labor movement would be a really great place to do a lot of what I'm talking about, except we have some of the most racist labor organizing I can think of in Canada, some of the most classist and sexist and transphobic labor organizing in this country. So it's hard to do it in organized labor, which has a big foothold still and a big role to play in Canada.
And also, just for the record, I know, from talking with Eve Engler and other people involved in the anti-imperialist movement, is a lot of big labor, big unions also consent to imperialism abroad, or purposely don't address Canadian imperialism abroad, even though they claim that we're against corporate Canada. But
well, but I mean, like, okay, so when you're like part of a union that like builds ships to be exported to other countries to use for their military, this is your bread and butter. This is your pension. This is how you pay your mortgage. So we're asking you to speak out against something that you're directly benefiting from. And that's not really realistic now, is it? So I do understand why these dynamics are inherently that they are hypocritical, right, in many ways, and why the labor movement can't live up to those like lofty kind of ideas that it sometimes proposes. So it's part of a greater anti-capitalist struggle. But I don't necessarily think like our problem is that we're not always connecting like the global to the local. I think there's just too few of us doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting, and a lot of us are burnt out constantly, are frustrated and tired constantly. Canada, for all of its struggles, is still a place of tremendous wealth and privilege. And so a lot of people can tune out from the pain and suffering that many people around them are feeling and experiencing. That's not going to continue if, we don't challenge capitalism. And what I always think about is if so many people are so comfortable today that they don't feel the need to fight back, how are they going to fight back when they fall down in the system, when they lose their class privilege? How easy is it going to be to fight back then when you've lost your resources, you've lost your home? Like when you're out here on the street in Toronto and you're underneath these giant condos that are being constructed for people who make $1 million a year, and you're on the ground because you just got evicted, it's hard to fight back because you're worried about your life. You're worried about where I'm going to sleep tonight. You're worried about, is the shelter that I want to use safe? Am I going to get robbed? Do I have enough to eat? Like, this is the contradiction, is that like people who are relatively comfortable often ask, well, why would I fight back? But then, of course, by the time that they've been put in a position where they might see the need, it's a lot harder to do so. So I hope that we can address that by, again, acting locally and trying to build solidarities, because this is a huge country with a big set of problems.
Well, here's hoping that that the broad Canadian Black racial justice movement, social justice movement does know how to chew gum and walk at the same time and connects, just like as just as what the U.S. is doing with Black Alliance for Peace. That the police brutality, state terror that you're fighting at home, the white supremacy, settler colonialism you're fighting at home is. That is Canadian imperialism. I mean, the Canadian military is the police on steroids, and then very briefly, And you don't have to comment on this, but what do you think it's going to take? Because one thing I actually do admire about Canada is I find that the black racial justice movement in Canada is much better at showing solidarity to the plight of Indigenous people. In general, I think the Canadian left is much better at showing, solidarity with Indigenous people compared to the U.S., where I think the anti-war movements, the workers' rights movement, the feminist movement, even the Green movement, I admire how they can chew gum and walk at the same time, realizing that that the U.S. military is connected to all the injustices people are fighting at home. But I find that the U.S. left has utterly failed in showing solidarity to Indigenous Americans on the mainland and in Hawaii and Alaska. And I'm just curious, what do you think it's going to take for the U.S. left, whether it's the Black Power movement, to get to the level Canada and the rest of the left is at in showing solidarity to Indigenous people?
That's an interesting and complex question. I mean, it does strike me that the way that our legal system is set up in Canada, there's much more baked in inherent recognition of the existence of Indigenous peoples than there is in the United States, where the idea was that by the time we're finished, y'all won't be here anymore. Now, I know that many people wanted to do that in Canada, but they failed. And the incredible and ongoing resistance of Indigenous peoples in this country that's the chief reason why we're able to be in solidarity with anybody, because they fought and they were successful in maintaining a foothold on their own territories, right? That is not to say that people didn't fight in what's now the United States of America. I don't want it to mean anyone's struggle. Things
or
worked
Australia,
out,
for that matter.
or Australia.
Also, yeah.
Things have worked out differently. There have been different dynamics in different countries. We still have an Indian Act in Canada, right? Like, we still have legal frames to think about indigeneity that America, I think, unless I'm not that versed on their history and their legal frameworks, but I think it's very different there. So I think that's one reason why it's different. I did hear that Angela Davis did a talk the other day and was actually talking about Indigenous solidarity. And a lot of people didn't appreciate what she had to say when she said that Black people need to be more in solidarity with Indigenous folks. And I think that what often happens.
Wow, really?
Oh, yeah, I don't.
And that's stunning coming from that's stunning because I criticize Angela Davis for sometimes making being soft on Obama, being soft on the Democratic Party, but that criticism aside, that's shocking that not only she would say that, but that she would get hostility for saying that about us Black people. We need to show more solidarity to Native Americans.
Twitter is my news feed, for better or for worse. And somebody I follow on Twitter was saying that Angela Davis was receiving quite a lot of flack from Black people for saying that. And I think that often happens because of zero-sum thinking, that we don't have enough as Black people to also lend our solidarity to other groups.
Yeah.
But this is the opposite of, as I was just saying, like, this is the opposite of what I believe we need. Like, this is solidarity. There's room enough for all of us to recognize one another. It's not about saying you spend so much time focusing on their problems that you don't have enough left for us. It's an amplifying, multiplying dynamic rather than a scarcity one that we are taught to believe. And I would also say that I have been thinking a lot more about this. I wrote a chapter in my book about Indigenous resistance in Canada in 2017. The book is all about the year 2017. It's essentially a chronicle of 2017.
This is the skin we're in.
The skin we're in, a year of Black resistance and power. It's a chronicle of 1 year. I took 1 year and I said, I just want to break it down month by month. Every month is a story. of Black, or in one chapter, Indigenous resistance in our country, with some historical context and a lot of research, so that we're not just talking about an event that happened that year, we're giving it a historical context for the reader as well. That was the purpose of the book. I included Indigenous resistance because it has really inspired me and informed my understanding of my own country. So I really feel like if you want to understand the territory that you're on, you need to be in radical solidarity with Indigenous peoples and the struggle that has allowed for us all to be here in this moment, right? So,
Completely agree.
and I think actually, you know, based on conversations that I have with like dear friends and comrades that help me think, I think maybe sometimes I have even overestimated the links within Canada. We like to pat ourselves on the back by comparing ourselves to Americans and saying, well, we're better. And that's a low bar, let's be honest.
Well, I only think you guys are much better on the Indigenous solidarity when it comes to anti-imperialists and so forth. That's a whole nother.
And there's a lot of great examples of our communities working together. And I do want that to continue. There's also a lot of racism and antipathy between these two groups in Canada, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of scarcity politics of what I was just mentioning, where we don't have time to support you because we're suffering so much right now. There's still a lot of that. But beyond that, and this is a new thing that I'm trying to grapple with based on a really generous challenge from a friend of mine recently, it needs to be multiracial, like truly. So we can't only talk about Black and Indigenous people. And let me give an example and correct the record of something I said recently that somebody has very charitably challenged me on. I was in a conversation with Elle Jones and Adolph Reed recently. And I talked about the solidarity between Black and Indigenous people during two events that happened a few years back. One was Black Lives Matter Toronto's tent city, where a Black man here by the name of Andrew Loku was murdered by a police officer. That police officer's name is Andrew Doyle. I like to say that because it's hard to find out the names of police in Canada who kill people. But Andrew Doyle killed Andrew Loku in 2015. And BLM Toronto engaged in a 16-day long, like kind of holding of space outside of the police headquarters, right outside the police headquarters in downtown Toronto. It's a very courageous, amazing display, amazing action. And I was there a lot. I slept there, you know, it was really powerful. And then after that, there's something called INAC in Canada, which is like Indigenous Affairs. And the government was talking about breaking INAC into these different departments. And Indigenous people were demonstrating against that. And I talked about how Black people went to those demonstrations because a lot of Indigenous people had also been at Tent City, and there's this thing happening. Somebody reminded me of something, or maybe taught me, I should say, about something that I didn't really know because we didn't see it. And that was that there were so many people behind the scenes who were neither Black nor Indigenous. There were white people. There were other people of different racial backgrounds who did a lot of work in Tent City, but who were not Black or Indigenous, and therefore were not seen, whose work and labor was not celebrated, and who contributed to this thing that I'm saying was so powerful that Black and Indigenous people led. Ideally, Youri, in the future, we won't have to do this thing where we say I'm Black or I'm Indigenous. I'm the one suffering. So you come, don't ask any friggin' questions, don't challenge me. I want your labor. You owe me because we're suffering here. No. Ideally, in the future, we will all, in a legitimate multiracial coalition, be able to sit together and appreciate each other's minds, right? Appreciate each other's hands and contributions, and make a truly like Fred Hampton-like multiracial coalition that will truly strike fear in the heart of the oppressor and threaten this system that we want to take down, not just Black and Indigenous. So That's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I'm so glad actually that you brought it up.
And couldn't have said it better myself. And just here's hoping that, again, it's all about just chewing gum and walking at the same time. I mean, as Ralph Nader, the best president we never had 3 times over, says that breaking through power, it's easier than you think. Showing solidarity, it's much easier than you think. And that's the only way that will vanquish this ghastly system of capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy, heteronormativity, patriarchy, you name it. And yeah, so yes, again,
Capitalism. Can I use that? I like that. Somehow I never got to capitalism.
Please do. Use capitalism and also use Neo-Dickensianism. You have a much bigger following on Twitter, so you can definitely change the world like that. My terms never go viral, so any. All right, before I let you go, we end the program normally with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust and later done by the French broadcaster Bernard Pivot and later perfected by my hero, the late great James Lipton. Desmond, it's your turn to do it.
Boy.
So Desmond, first off, what is your favorite word?
What's my favorite word?
Yeah, favorite word.
That's so hard. I'll give you a favorite word, I guess. I'm blanking because I'm under pressure here.
Justice, revolution, or
no, nothing like that. Like, my favorite word would have to be something more like I don't know, something sillier. Like
that's dope, or
oh, this is so hard. Like I could think of like words that I use a lot.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Oh, okay, we're going to come back to this and I'm going to think for a second.
Okay. We'll come back to what's your least favorite word then? Least favorite word.
Least favorite word. That's maybe easier.
All right, go ahead.
I think one of my least favorite words in the English language is controversy. Because I almost never hear the word controversy used in a way that is useful. It just describes something that it's usually a stand-in for a word that people don't want to say. Like the controversial practice of police killing black people. I don't like the word controversy.
All right. Perfect. Then what turns you on spiritually, creatively, or emotionally? What turns you what turns you on spiritually, creative, or psychologically?
Birds.
Birds.
I have a hard on for birds.
Then what turns you off?
The
police, right?
I mean, that's too easy, but in general, I think disdain turns me off. When people express disdain for another person, sometimes it's justified. But if like, that feeling that we have of like, we get taught to like be like disgusted of like a certain kind of bug or a spider or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And that's probably not good either. But when people express that kind of emotion about another person, it gives me creeps. So I think that maybe disdain is a good answer there.
Okay, then what sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike? What sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
Sorry, what kind of noise?
What sound or noise do you love, and then what sound or noise do you dislike?
Sound or noise. Okay, I can do this. I like the sound of the clock tower at Old City Hall in downtown Toronto when it rings on the hour.
Okay.
Old City Hall happens to be a courthouse, unfortunately, but it is also a very beautiful building with gargoyles and cool shit on it that we would never take the time to do nowadays. And there's something about, if people know like Big Ben and stuff, Big Ben has this formula, right?
Yeah.
Where it's ringing its song, playing stages of its song as it goes through the quarter hour. But then on the hour, you get the whole song, and then you get the bongs for what time it is. And there's this pause.
Interesting. Well, interesting. When I come visit Canada, hopefully it'll be next year. This year I have other commitments, but hopefully when I come to visit Canada, and it will be Toronto, you're gonna have to take me there. So
it's you can basically see it when you get outside of Union Station and you look up Bay Street. But there's something about this silence after the song plays and right before the big boom to start telling you what hour it is. I'm just like waiting like a child for this sound, and it echoes, and I don't know, bells do something for me. I adore that sound. A sound that
but then what's the sound that you dislike then?
Yeah, a sound that I dislike very much would be
police sirens.
No.
We've been talking so much about the police, and that's all I can think of as like as your lawyer.
Luckily, I get to think about other things sometimes, but I'll talk about a sound that's actually right next door. This is funny. I don't know why my mind is going here today, but next to Old City Hall is New City Hall, where I spent many years as a reporter covering local politics in Toronto. And in City Hall, New City Hall, when they are trying to get everybody back from wherever they are in the chamber to have a vote, they have this bell, another kind of bell, a very different, horrible, evil kind of bell that plays. And because I've spent so many years in that chamber and it had to hear this sound trying to like wrangle these counselors like cats, I cannot stand the sound of these bells that call the city councilors back to their chamber. It is one of my least favorite sounds in the world, and I've probably had bad dreams where that sound was involved.
All right, then next question: what's your favorite curse words?
Oh, can I say?
And seeing as you're from Canada, if you have a French curse word, you are allowed to choose another language. So, what's your favorite curse word?
Okay, well, since you said that, I grew up as a French immersion student, and I do like that in French, in Quebecois French, all the swear words have to do with the church. So,
no offense to any of my devout friends, but yeah, go ahead.
My apologies to somebody who's obviously going to be bothered by this, but when I was growing up and going to school, we used to ride the bus, and my school used to share a bus with the like core French, like fully French school. And there was this kid who would just be swearing up a storm every morning, and everything was "Hostie tabernacle, hostie tabernacle." And if you don't know what that is,
hostie tabernacle.
Yeah, hostie is literally the host, so the piece of bread in the church that they give you to eat, which symbolizes literally the body of Jesus Christ. This is one of the worst things that you can say because you're making a curse about the body of Christ.
Using the Lord's name in vain, yeah.
And tabernacle is the tabernacle. It's the place where the bread is kept in the church. And this kid loved hostie tabernacle and would just say this, and I was just like, I was in awe. So I do really like that, even though it's not nice to say in certain companies. And I've said it more times.
And then, what profession would you love to? What profession would you love to do? So, if you were doing the fantastic racial and social justice work that you do, and being an author and being more or less an independent freelance journalist, yeah. So, if you weren't doing that, what would you love to do? What would you love to devote your time to?
I would love to be a professional soccer player. And if I couldn't do that, I would love to study like physics and astronomy, something I really don't understand, but that endlessly fascinates me. And like I was looking at all the releases of the James Webb Telescope images. I love images of like Jupiter and Saturn and like nebulae and stuff like this. So maybe that.
Wow, interesting. And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Other than a police officer. We finally made it back. We finally made it back.
Exactly.
I think like probably something having to do with like immigration bureaucracy. I think the immigration system is just so confounding and evil. And if I had to be part of the like administration of people having to wait for their visas, know whether they're going to be invited to become a permanent resident or a citizen, or be afraid that they're going to get deported, and it was just my job to be some person like processing these files, being like, "Yep, sorry, this is my job," I would probably lose it.
And actually, and then actually before, and then have you thought of what your favorite word is yet, by any chance?
I've been really trying so hard. I apparently can't chew gum and walk when it comes to holding thoughts in my head. So we have a problem. But
all right, we'll leave it blank for the moment, and you can and you can always message me, and I can just put it in the pinned note section. And then the final one is, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is the religious belief that you think is the afterlife, or even if you're an atheist, agnostic, what would you like to hear, whatever deity or several say to you as you arrive to the afterlife and hopefully paradise?
I'm sorry, I was drunk.
Really? Really? Not really? Not your family's over there, or welcome, Jimi Hendrix is about to play, or?
If I meet the creator at the pearly gates, I need an explanation. And so yes, I'm sorry I was drunk, I think would be a good starting point. It would explain a lot. So yeah, that's my answer.
Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, a special All Things Canada Black History Month special, and our Make Me Want to Holler All Things Black Diaspora. We were joined on this edition with Desmond Cole, author, journalist, racial and social justice activist, and abolitionist, and very much a flaming left-winger, and author of the book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, which people should get. It's on top of my list of books to get once I'm done with several others, and people also need to get Robin Maynard's book, Policing Black Lives. Desmond, thank you so much for coming on the program. I hope that this will be the first of many conversations, because there's so much more about why we should be abolishing the police that I wanted to get into, but we're going to save that for another time. But again, thank you so much for joining me today, and it was a real honor to speak to you, finally.
Thanks for taking the time, Youri. I really appreciate coming on.